Right. So, hi everybody. My name's Sam Nokes. If you haven't met me before, I look after the property management department for Jellis Craig, Donington and Richmond. And I want to take the opportunity tonight to talk you through the changes to the Residential Tenancies Act that started this week, or most of them started this week. So tonight I'm just going to run through each of these core changes and some of the more important ones. And the idea being that we'll give you a brief overview of everything. We'll try and get through that in about half an hour, and then that'll open it up for everyone to be able to ask any questions that you might have and the specifics that you would like answered. So if you've got any questions, please feel free to put them into the chat section, and when we get up to the end of the session, once we've finished going through the normal content, we'll answer those specific questions for you. Okay. All right. Well, we might make a start. So just before we get into the detail, it is important that we put a little disclaimer on things tonight to say that this is not a disclaimer on the information. This is not legal advice and does not pertain to anybody's specific situations. This is general advice about the changes to the Residential Tenancies Act, and that the information that we use is drawn from that of Consumer Affairs and the information provided by the Victorian Government. Although I will make the note that the Victorian Government is yet to actually release the full condensed version of the Act. It was supposed to come out on Monday, and instead of releasing the Act on Monday, they put up a little note saying that they hadn't finished their homework and they were yet to finish writing the Act. But that's okay. We'll make do with the Amendments Act and the previous Act and combining those ourselves. Now, a lot of the information that we're going to go through tonight is a lot of it is only coming to hand or has come to hand this week. A lot of things like the Director of Consumer Affairs directions and guidelines and documentary evidence and so on has only just started to be released in the last couple of days. So it is evolving, and there are a lot of things that we'll talk about tonight where it'll take somebody being taken to the tribunal to get a clear answer. But I think overarching what I can tell you is that the laws that come into effect this week really do quite a good job of providing much more clarity about the Residential Tenancies Act and provide for a lot less grey area than we've had before. So these changes are the largest changes to happen to the Act since its original inception in 1997. The Residential Tenancies Act is staying as the Residential Tenancies Act 1997. It just includes the amendments as at the 29th of March. And so what that means is that the vast majority of the Act remains unchanged, and that there's just amendments to that Act. It's about 132 reforms in total. And over the last couple of months, we've been going through a process of retraining our entire workforce to ensure that all of the people who work for Jellis Craig are upskilled on the new sections and understanding how those sections and all of the additions, the new regulations, the guidelines and all of the new forms that go with that, how they actually work so that they can advise you as our clients. So terminology changes. I think this one's a bit silly, but you can see where it comes from, and you'll start to notice the language that we use as an agency will start to change. Certainly, we've been through all of our standard documents and updated that. So tenants and our renters, our landlord clients and our rental providers, and tenancy agreements are rental reforms. And for those that operate a rooming house, it's moved from an owner to an operator. We don't really manage rooming houses at Jellis Craig, but worth noting for you all the same. So as far as the changes to the Act are concerned, they've broken them up into three core sections: before a tenancy agreement is entered into, during a tenancy agreement, and ending a tenancy agreement. And that's how I'll structure our session tonight. So before a tenancy agreement is entered into, the property now needs to meet certain minimum requirements. Now, it's important to note that the minimum standards that they've set do not apply to fixed-term tenancies that started prior to the 29th of March. But as those fixed-term tenancies expire and they move into periodic tenancies, then the property will need to meet those minimum standards. Also, any property that's been leased on or after the 29th of March will need to meet these minimum standards. So I won't go through them in depth about what each one of them is, but you can see them on the screen there. I think some of the ones that are probably of more note are the mould and dampness. So any mould and dampness in a property, which includes things like rising damp, is not considered to meet the minimum standard. There's also quite a grey term that they've used, which is structural soundness. And if a property is not structurally sound, then it doesn't meet the minimum standard. Now, that's a very, very broad term. And in speaking with Consumer Affairs, the Director is expected to issue some guidelines in relation to what structural soundness is over the next couple of years as a body of law starts to be developed. But you could take that to mean that if you've got a property where you know, the floor is on a quite a steep angle, or you've got walls that are a bit wonky, that probably wouldn't meet the standard. It also talks about being weatherproof, so ensuring that what's outside can't get inside, and that will probably be the standard. The standards aren't particularly high for those things. It's just meeting a minimum standard. They're not trying to create palaces out of every rental property, but it's just making sure that the properties are in fact habitable. The shame of that is that those lower quality properties that were previously rented out for less than they were worth because they were in a poor condition, and you know, you get 3 or 4 sharers into your share house in Richmond or up near Monash Uni at the top of Malvern East, and they'd go in there and a couple of 20-somethings wouldn't really complain too much and they'd enjoy it. And I'm sure, as I have, most of you have probably lived in one of those properties during your uni days yourself. Unfortunately, that property type now just can't exist in Victoria. Those properties will cost more because more work is going to need to be done to them, and I think that's a shame, because it is a sector and a grouping of properties that's not going to be available. Lighting and ventilation is one that is slightly more difficult, and is one that you no doubt will probably end up hearing from your property manager about in certain circumstances. The requirement for lighting is that each room that is habitable has to meet a standard of lighting which is reasonable for the use of the room. The guide that's been given is the ability to open and read a book in the room without needing to have the lights on. Now, that sounds a bit silly, I'm sure, to some of you, but if you've been in some properties that are borrowed light bedrooms, so where maybe you don't have a window facing outside, maybe you've got a frosted bedroom door or something of the like, those properties won't meet that minimum standard. And so there may need to be alterations made to the property. Alternatively, there are properties like your single front Victorian terraces where you maybe don't have a window, maybe there's no skylight. It's been a great bedroom for a long time, you know, especially for people who are shift workers sleeping during the day. But because that room, even if it's used as a study, is capable of being used as a bedroom, you would need to put lighting in there, put natural lighting in, and that might mean having to cut a hole in the roof and putting a skylight in. So those are things that we'll talk to each respective client about. Charles Craig's going through a process over the next 6 or so months to review every single property on our rent roll, all of our properties through our routine inspections, to ensure that every one of the properties meets the minimum standard, and where it doesn't, advise our clients of what the things are that need to be changed, and work through a process to get them up to date. The other thing I should mention, and we'll talk about it when we come to repairs, is that all of these things on screen are now an urgent repair, irrespective of whether the property needed to meet the standard or not. So you might have a property that doesn't meet the standard in relation to, let's say, lighting, but if the tenant were to report that there wasn't adequate lighting in the bedroom, that would become an urgent repair and would need to be done immediately. That obviously will cause a bit of heartache and cost in some instances, but again, it's something that we'll just work through and be reasonable about to come to a good conclusion. So safety-related checks, no doubt all of you have been receiving a body of emails from myself and Angela Ambrosino about all of this. And for those of you that don't know, Angela is my right-hand person, lady, who helps me with many things. So if you ever see an email from Angela, it's probably an email from me, and you're welcome to reply back to both of us. But that's why you sometimes see emails from the two of us. So the standards for these are brand new standards. The Australian standards that have been set up for the compliance checks are brand new standards. We've had a number of clients say to us, oh, well, the property's only been built 6 months ago and I had electrical certificates and gas safety certificates issued at the time. but unfortunately they're not up to the new standard requirement called, which is they refer to as periodic inspections. So all properties need to have this done, irrespective of when the tenancy commenced. So for properties where the lease commenced on or after the 29th of March, they need to be done as soon as practicable. And for properties that commenced prior to the 29th of March, you have up to 2 years to do the electrical and safety gas checks and up to 12 months to do the smoke alarm checks. For those checks, it's important to remember that there may be a list of compliance requirements to come off the back of those. I think for our more modern properties, it's unlikely that there's going to be many, if any, compliance requirements. But for a property, we take a 110-year-old Victorian home in Malvern, it's likely that that property will have a body of work that needs to be done to it, whether that is all the way to rewiring the property if it's got dangerous wiring in it, or if it's just simply a switchboard upgrade. So it's important to be prepared if you are the owner of an older property, to be prepared that it may in fact be a large amount of compliance work to do. The danger of all that is that when they do the compliance checks, to comply with the standard, if they find that the property doesn't meet the standard and they note that it's dangerous, they will have to disconnect either the gas or electricity from either a specific appliance, if the appliance is the issue, or possibly from the property, which would mean that getting it reconnected and getting the work done becomes very urgent. Again, we'll advise you about that at the time, but if you're worried about your specific property, please let us know, because we can work through that for you on a proactive basis rather than a reactive basis if you feel like your property might be a concern. Swimming pools and spas, if you've got one, you'll know about it. We sent out quite a lot of documentation about that last year when the requirement to register and comply pools came about. If you've got a pool and you haven't yet registered it, a pool or a spa, I should say, it is important that whether or not it is for use or not, even if you've got it at the property and you've locked it away so that it can't be used, it still must be registered with your local council, and you still must do the compliance requirements for it as well. So if you haven't organised that, please speak to your property manager and they'll be able to make those arrangements for both registering and complying the pool and spa fencing. None of the properties that we manage have water tanks. The water tanks specifically speak about bushfire prone areas. But if you happen to manage a property or own a property in a bushfire prone area, it is important to note that there are compliance checks for those water tanks as well. So some changes to the way in which we advertise the property. Now, these are pretty sensible changes, and they just bring residential tenancies in line with the rest of commerce. There were changes to the Australian Consumer Law a number of years ago when the Australian Consumer Law took over from the other relevant acts, which meant that you or tightened up misleading and deceptive misleading statements, false misleading statements and deceptive conduct. And ultimately, these changes just align the Residential Tenancies Act with that. So to make those changes and make them effective, we are unable to now offer properties for lease or advertise them on a range plus or offers above pricing statements. Now, at Jellis Craig, it hasn't been our normal practice to do that for many years, but now that practice is in fact outlawed, so it can't be done anymore. One of the real shames, and it's because it was abused, is the removal of the ability to invite rental bids. Now, in days gone by, some agents and some owners would attempt to get tenants to bid off against each other to achieve the highest rent. That has now been outlawed, and that behaviour was considered to not be fair. But one of the consequences of that is that we're unable to go to an application and ask them to increase their offer at all. So if we've got an application from an applicant that is the best applicant by way of references and everything else, but they've offered, let's say, $950, and we have an application that is not as good, but they've offered $1,100 a week, we are now unable and restricted from going to the $950 application and saying, look, the owner would like to accept your application, but only if you increase your offer to where the other property is, or even where they've applied under market value, under the advertised price. Let's say we're marketing it at $1,000 a week, tenants offered $950. We are not allowed to go to them and say, we'd like you to increase your offer to $1,000 a week. So that's a real shame, because it means that tenants might miss out. But we'll work through that to find the best solution while not overstepping the mark. There are ways of talking around that, but just it is important to note that as the owner, we aren't able to go on your behalf and explicitly say, please increase your offer. Obviously, we can't make false and misleading representations, and we can't engage in deceptive conduct. The things that are inferred from that, Jells Creek's had the practice of not advertising properties with what parking permits are available for many years. But that's one of the things that can be considered to be a false or misleading statement, because it's not the owner of the property who makes the representation about what parking permits are available. It's the council who makes that representation. So to include that in an advertisement would be considered to be false and misleading, and it was used as an example by Consumer Affairs in one of their documents. Obviously, things like photography as well. We can't be false and misleading about the condition of the property. So it's likely that the last time you marketed the property was a couple of years ago, the property's now a little older, a little more tired, or maybe there's been changes internally. We will be asking our clients to update their marketing materials, photography, scans, floor plans, and so on, if it's required, and that'll need to happen on a regular basis. So gone are the days of pulling the advertising photos from 2013 and popping them up this year. The property needs to reflect its current state. One of the other things that is an impact to that as well is about making any representations about what is going to happen to the property if it's not in fact going to happen. In the past, there might have been representations made about the property being in a quiet location, but it turns out there's actually going to be construction happening next door, and you as the property owner were aware of that, or should have been aware of it, because the council sends the information around. Those sorts of statements we need to be very careful about making, because it may be a quiet street, a quiet area, but maybe not for the tenure of that lease. And so we'll just need to be fairly pensive about those. We also now have a disclosure statement that we need to prepare before we rent out any property. Now, that disclosure statement requires a number of questions to be answered. That will come to you as the property owner as a request from us, saying, as we're listing the property, we need you to answer these questions, and you, to the best of your ability, need to go through and answer those. Some of them we'll be able to help you with, like who's the owner's corporation, what are the owner's corporation rules, but some of them are about your knowledge of the property and whether you are aware of something, like if the property's been the site of a homicide in the last 5 years. When you see it, it's a very easy document to complete, but we will need to provide that to renters. That's aligning residential tenancies with sales, in that the requirement for sales now is a mandatory disclosures document, and now we have a similar one that needs to be provided. I stress that these aren't Jells Creek changes, these are industry changes, and everyone will have to do the same thing. The maximum amount of bond has been updated as well. We used to be allowed to take as much bond as we wanted, over $350 a week. That amount's now been moved up to $900 a week. For those playing at home, it's double the median rent, which is currently $450, and it's the same as what was used in '97. So the median rent in 1997 was $175 a week. It's now $450, so working its way up. Now, $900 a week captures probably about 70% of the properties in our area, and about 30% are over that amount. And we'll advise each client at the time about what's the appropriate bond to take. But if it is under $900 a week, we are restricted to 1 month's bond unless we get a VCAT order to allow us to do otherwise. The unlawful discrimination, we have to provide a document to tenants about that, so that we won't discriminate against them, and there are going to be much harsher penalties if someone is discriminated against for one of the protected attributes. The other part too, which is new, is that we must provide a free set of keys, so not at the renter's cost, for each person, each renter who is on the lease. So if you've got a 2-bedroom apartment, the owner's corporation has issued you 2 sets of keys at settlement, but you've got 3 people moving in, maybe a couple and a single, you will need to, at your cost, provide the tenant with an additional set of keys. That, again, is something that we'll organise for you. And we've spoken to you previously about the changes in pets, but essentially, tenants are allowed to have pets in rental properties unless there's a substantial reason to not allow it. Again, we can advise about that at the time. So during the tenancy, they have created a change to clarify when you can get a tenant out on rent arrears. So let me be very clear about this, that the ability to serve a notice to vacate to the tenant for rent arrears has not changed. When the tenant reaches 14 days in arrears, on the 15th day, you can serve them a notice to vacate and they must move out. But if they pay all of the amount that is owing prior to the end of the notice, so with the 14-day notice to vacate, by the end of that 14-day period, the notice is automatically cancelled and you cannot apply to the tribunal for possession. If the tenant doesn't pay by the end of that notice, you are allowed to make your application to the tribunal. But it is likely that unless there's extenuating circumstances, the tenant will be put on a payment plan to repay that debt. If the tenant, and this is what the 5 strikes rule is, if the tenant has 5 notice to vacate for rent arrears served in a 12-month period, the 5th notice to vacate is not cancelled by payment. So if somebody's playing the game, they know the system, when they get up to the 5th, that's it, too bad, you're out. They also aren't allowed to put the tenant on a payment plan on the 5th if you end up with VCAT. However, the 12-month period commences on the day the first fixed term starts and is a reoccurring from there. So if the tenant starts on the 12th of June, but they don't get into arrears until November, the 12 months does not start from November when the first notice is served. It starts from when the tenancy commences. Now, we hope that that will be changed. There is already some lobbying to have that changed because the description's poor. Should start, in our opinion, from the date of the first 14-day notice. But it is important to note that at the moment, at the stand, that 12-month period commences at the start of the lease. So you might find the tenant does 2 or 3 months of getting up to a notice to vacate, and then the 4th notice is actually in the next 12-month period. That would make it notice number 1. Again, we'll provide you with advice on this if your tenant falls into arrears, and we'll give you a clear mapping out of what that will look like. But it is an important change to be aware of. The change came into effect already. It's been in for a while now. You can't do rent increases more than once every 12 months. It was previously once every 6 months. But what they found was that about 99% of all rent increases served were at greater than 12-month intervals anyway. So it wasn't really being utilised, so they got rid of it. When we do serve a notice to vacate, we have to provide the method of calculation we've used to arrive at the new rent, which means that if it's market rent, that's fine. We'll need to provide comparables. If we're doing it by CPI, which we wouldn't do at the moment because the housing CPI is negative, but if we're doing it by CPI or some other method of calculation, then we need to provide that on the notice as well. They have, in the Act, also clarified the responsibility of utility charges. The most notable of these is the excessive utility bills and the initial connection costs. So if we've got, let's say we've got a pipe leaking in the wall, nobody knows about it for a couple of months, tenant gets their bill and it's very high, then the difference between their normal bill and the excess bill is the responsibility of the landlord. Now, yes, we can go with the plumber's bill to South East Water, Yarra Valley Water, City West Water, and apply to have the bill reduced, absolutely, but any difference between their normal usage and the excess usage from the leak would be the cost of the landlord. The other thing that they've clarified is the initial connection costs for telephone and NBN, internet, specifically NBN, is that of the landlord. So when a property is brand new, it's never been connected to the internet before or been connected to a phone line before, everybody, the electrician will put everything in now, and the Telstra will run all the cables up to the house, and there's a little box on the wall, and there's 2 wires in there, and no one connects them. And what happens is the first time someone moves into that property, Telstra charges $299, come out, connect the 2 wires together. That $299 initial connection cost, and whatever the initial connection cost is from NBN, it does vary depending on the type of connection, is the cost for the landlord, residential rental provider. That cost cannot be passed back to the tenant, and it will be a reimbursement to the tenant because it's on the tenant's bill. Once the tenant that's connected, that tenant moves out, now the tenant moves in, the cost to reconnect, so the second connection, is the cost of the renter. It's only when the connection is brand new and has never been used before, or if NBN is being installed in the property for the first time. So urgent repairs, there's always been an urgent repairs limit. It was previously $1,800. It's now $2,500. They take that amount, for those playing at home as well, they take that amount from the average cost of replacing a hot water unit and what they expect that cost to be over, to increase to over 5 years. So 5 years ago, they believed that it was $1,800. It was going to be $1,800 today. They believe it's going to be $2,500 in 5 years' time. So that's what they've set it out. Now, the urgent repairs limit, the process around that has not changed. They have changed the time frame to be a little bit shorter, but it basically means that there's an urgent repair and the tenant makes all efforts to contact the agent and the landlord, and they can't get in touch with anyone. They can undertake an urgent repair up to the value of $2,500, and the landlord must pay the tenant back within 7 days. We obviously have processes in our office to reduce that. I think in my 15 years of property management, I think we've had a tenant do a repair that we've had to pay them back for 3 times. So it isn't particularly common because we've got good practices. Tenants are able to get in touch with our recommended repairers and so on. But do be aware that that amount has increased. And you cannot reduce it by agreement either. So if you want the tenant to agree for it to be $1,000 or not to have one, you can't do that. It has to be 2.5 as a minimum. They've also added some new things to the urgent repairs list. Most notably, they have now added air conditioning. So previously, air conditioning was non-urgent repair, which meant it had 14 days to be repaired. It's now an urgent repair and will need to be done immediately. Anything to do with the safety devices in urgent repair, pest infestations are now an urgent repair, and any mould and damp in the property that is caused by way of the structure of the property is now an urgent repair. So if the tenant reports rising damp in the hallway, that needs to be attended to immediately, which will be a bit interesting because if anybody's ever booked a rising damp guy, he's normally about 4 to 6 weeks out. So we'll see. So it comes from that. Modifications, been a lot of talk about modifications. The general idea around modifications is that people are renting for longer. We've already seen our average tenancy over the last 5 years increase from 16 months to 20 months. The time somebody's in a property for. So it is increasing and we are seeing that in the real world. And what they want is for people to move more at home. Now, what they've done is they've split the list into 2 lists. There's the list of modifications that someone can make to the property without the landlord's consent. They don't need to ask you, they can just go and make the changes. And that's what these are. The other list is what the tenant can ask you for, and you are not able to unreasonably withhold your consent. We have a good process in our office where a tenant, if they ask for a modification, we go through an approval process, we make sure that it's recorded, and then we update our details. So at the end of the tenancy, we importantly make sure that the tenant returns the property in the condition in which it was given to them. Now, if the tenant goes and does a good job of painting the bedrooms and it's a nice neutral colour, obviously they've probably added to the value of the property. We won't ask them to return that one for you. But if, let's say, for instance, the tenant has installed maybe picture hooks throughout the property, then we will make them return the property back to the condition they were in. And you can ask the tenant to do that using a suitably qualified person. I'll talk about how the tenant returns the property, but reasonably clean has been much improved. We've got a great description of what that is now, and that's going to help us with end of tenancy issues. So, the conclusion of a lease. So when a tenant gives, at the end of a tenancy, when you as the landlord want to give notice, you now must have a specific reason. We used to have a notice called the 120-day no specific reason notice, which you could give to a renter and not need to provide them with any reason for it. That's now been removed. You have to have a specific reason that you want the renter to leave. They've also restricted the use of the end of fixed term tenancy notice. So previously we had a 90-day end of fixed term tenancy notice where a tenancy is over 6 months, and for less than 6 months it was a 60-day notice. Now those notices are still rare, but we are only able to use those notices on the first fixed term. And the reason for that is if you give a tenant a second fixed term, you are saying, as far as the Consumer Affairs and the government's concerned, you are saying, I accept these tenants and their performance, I'm happy to keep them on. And so because of that belief, you aren't able to serve an end of fixed term tenancy notice in a second term. Because what we used to do is if we missed the period, we wanted to give the tenant an end of fixed term tenancy, that's fine, we just give them a 3-month lease and serve them a 60-day notice and out they go. But unfortunately, we can't do that anymore. So I've had many clients saying, what? So if I don't like the tenants and we missed the mark, I'm stuck with them. Essentially, yes, that's what the government has done. You would need to make a change of use of the premises, either be moving into it, selling it, or so on, for that to occur. There are consequences for that. So with serving a notice to vacate, one of my lovely clients is demolishing a property. They're about to do a rebuild found out this week. You must have certain documentary evidence for certain notices to vacate. So if you are planning on selling the property, you need to have already engaged an agent and provide the tenant with a copy of the authority at the time you serve the notice. If you're not engaging an agent, you need to have proof that you've prepared a contract of sale. If you are planning on moving into the property, you need to have a statutory declaration, which is properly witnessed, stating that you are moving into the property or a specific relation is moving into the property. It's important to talk to your property manager before you make any plans around that, because there are some restrictions. And all of these carry a 6-month prohibition of letting. So any of these notices on screen at the moment, if you, of these 4 at the top, if you want the tenant to leave on that basis, you must, you're not allowed to relet the property for 6 months unless you go to the tribunal and get permission, irrespective of whether the tenant consents or not. There are also some good new notices around threats or intimidation. If you've got a tenant in the property who is threatening, making serious threats or intimidation, other than threatening to use their rights, you are able to ask them to leave the property, which is great news, and vastly increases the safety for both property owners, agents, and the contractors that we send to properties from time to time. They've also added the break lease conditions to the Residential Tenancies Act. Previously, that was inferred from another section. It's now in there. If a tenant is breaking their lease, it's now much easier to hold them to that. It is important to note that, again, on a renewal on a second term, second, third, fourth term of the existing rent, you can't claim the fees from the tenant. You can only claim rent up until the date another tenant starts. But if a tenant breaks their initial fixed term, you can claim the costs associated with the creation of that tenancy. Cleaning, great news. If you have proof that the property was professionally cleaned before the start of the tenancy, you can make the tenant use professional cleaning at the end of the tenancy, which is absolutely fantastic. We can also require the tenant to do professional cleaning where it is required to restore the premises to its previous condition minus fair wear and tear. If the property, we don't have proof that the property was professionally cleaned, the old standard of reasonably clean still applies, and that has been better defined to help us both align your expectations as the property owner and also make sure the tenant gets the property to the right state. And some examples of what that is has also been provided in the guidelines. There are a few differences in relation to long-term leases. A long-term lease is anything over 5 years. We don't recommend to any of our clients to enter into a tenancy of 5 years or more because it is very restrictive on you. And also, if you needed to sell the property at any point during that, it will significantly impact on the saleability and value of the property. So we don't recommend entering into those tenancies for the most part. And that's it on the main changes. So I hope that was informative and helpful for you. If you've got any specific questions, I'll be on for about another half an hour, 40 minutes to answer any of those questions for you. So please feel free to jump in the chat box and pop your questions in there, and I'll work through those for you now. Now we get the awkward bit of all webinars where we sit and wait for people to write questions. If you want to jump off and you've got to get dinner ready for the kids, or you're getting starving, got to run to the gym, that's fine. We are recording the session and we will send out the recording to everyone at the end. So no need to hang around if you've got other things you need to do. For the conclusion of the lease, how much notice do we need to give? We want to move back into the property to live in it. Great question. It's 60 days notice if you want to move back into the property, and that can be given at any time, as long as the end of your notice doesn't break a fixed term. It is important to note too that where you serve the tenant notice on a 60 or a 90-day tenancy, end of fixed term tenancy, or any of the other 60-day notices for premises to be sold and so on, then it is important to note the tenant can respond with a 14-day notice to vacate, and that can break the fixed term without penalty. So if your lease ends on let's say the 20th of June, you serve a notice to vacate for 60 days for you to move back in on the 20th of June. If the tenant comes back and says, hey, I found something, I'm moving in 2 weeks' time, and that makes it the end of May, then the tenant is able to leave on that date, and there are no penalties for them, and they don't have to pay rent to the end of the fixed term. Yes, I did mention the stat dec. There's a statutory declaration. We've created one for you. So if you say to us, hey, I need to move in, we'll forward you that stat dec document. You simply complete it, go and have it properly witnessed, and we attach that to the notice to vacate. The statutory declaration is just you saying, yes, it is me or a specific party that's moving in. They have to be named and the relationship name. And if it's someone who's dependent on you, you have to describe how they're dependent on you, and that they normally reside with you, and that you also are aware of the prohibition of letting. And once you have that signed, like I say, we provide a copy of that to the renter. Hopefully that answered the question for you. Earlier side, this is something about having vermin-proof bins. Is this the bin outside the property? What is the example of vermin-proof bin? Yes, Deborah, hi to you. Yeah, the question from Deborah is an excellent one. The original version of the regulations just said vermin-proof bin. It was updated to say vermin-proof bin or that provided by the council. So a normal council bin is fine. The vermin-proof bins other than the council mainly relates to some rural municipalities. Not all shires in Victoria provide a rubbish removal and service. Obviously, most of us live in Metro Melbourne, so we wouldn't necessarily know that. I certainly had to go and figure that out. And so if you live in one of those areas and there's no council bins provided by the council, then the owner must provide a vermin-proof bin. That's basically one like your council bin, but it's one that has a weighted lid and that pests can't get into. Hopefully that answered the question for you, Deb. Very welcome. What steps do I need to take at this time with an existing tenancy agreement that started before the 29th of March? Thanks, Will. Good question. You need to have the safety checks, electrical, gas, and smoke alarm checks done within 2 years or 12 months of the smoke alarm. All you need to do for that is to subscribe to the detector inspector service that we've popped there. Send an email out to you on, and we will just organise for that to happen in the required time. It is important to note that with those requirements, if the tenant asks us when was the last safety check done, we have to get it done as soon as practicable as well. So it is important to be subscribed to that service for that reason. Other than that, it's only getting prepared for the property to meet minimum standards. So what will happen, Will, is we'll go to the next routine inspection, and we'll provide you with a report after that that says that the property met minimum standards or it didn't meet minimum standards. And if it didn't, we'll tell you what they are and what we need to do to fix those. And then we'll get them done by the time the property is then rented out again. Hopefully that answered the question for you, Will. Welcome. Do I have any other questions? Thanks, Deb. My property will be leased probably in a month's time. Will the agent be checking my property meets minimum standards before entering into a lease? Yes, we will be doing that for you. It actually won't be before you enter into the lease. We'll be doing the minimum standards checks either at the final inspection if the tenant hasn't left yet, or at the condition report, just from a timing point of view. If it's a property that we've never leased for you before and it's new to market, then yes, we will be doing the checks prior to it being rented out. We've just got two different processes there. But yes, we will still be informing you of that at the time and making sure that the property is compliant for you. No worries. Okay. Any other questions? Thanks, Will. Great. All right, guys. Well, we'll call it at that point. Thank you so much for everybody joining. As I said, we will forward a copy of the recording to everybody after the webinar tonight. I want to thank you all again for joining us. And if you have any questions, please either reach out to myself or your property manager, and we'll be able to answer any specific questions that you've got. Thanks, and have a great day.